It was a bright Saturday morning, and Marcus Reed, a 28-year-old graphic designer, was preparing to tackle the day ahead. Standing at 6 feet 2 inches with deep brown skin and short, neatly lined hair, Marcus carried himself with a quiet confidence. His sharp jawline framed a warm but watchful face, and his eyes, alert and perceptive, often scanned his surroundings with care. He wore his favorite navy blue hoodie, a subtle statement about comfort over appearances, along with black joggers and clean white sneakers. His personal motto, "Stay calm, stay sharp," guided him through most of life's challenges, especially the ones he knew he couldn't control. Growing up in a predominantly black neighborhood, Marcus had learned how to navigate different social spaces with precision. He knew when to speak up, when to stay quiet, and most importantly, when to leave. But today, he wasn't thinking about any of that. Today, he had one goal in mind: grab a few essentials from Radley's Market and get back home before his Saturday Zoom meeting with a new freelance client. As a graphic designer, Marcus had built a reputation for his creativity and professionalism. His clients often praised his calm demeanor, and his friends joked that he had the patience of a monk. But patience, he knew, had its limits. While he preferred to avoid unnecessary conflict, he wasn't one to back down when disrespected. The sun peeked through the blinds of his one-bedroom apartment as the sound of his alarm echoed through the room. Marcus stretched, his muscles tightening and loosening like a rubber band, and after a quick shower, he slipped into his usual weekend gear. Breakfast was a quick affair: scrambled eggs, whole grain toast, and a banana smoothie, consumed as he scrolled through client emails on his tablet. After checking off a few early tasks for his freelance work, Marcus glanced at the clock. 9:45 a.m. "All right, gotta head out," he muttered to himself. He grabbed his phone, wallet, and keys, tossing them into his backpack before stepping out. The streets of Westfield Heights were alive with the hum of city life. Kids on bikes zipped past him, the aroma of fresh bagels wafted from the corner bakery, and the faint buzz of car engines echoed from the main street. It was the kind of neighborhood where people nodded at each other in passing, but not much more. Marcus appreciated the peace. His walk to Radley's Market was short, just 10 minutes from his apartment. He preferred to shop early in the day when the store was less crowded. It was one of those mid-sized grocery stores that tried to present itself as family-owned, but everyone knew it was part of a larger chain. He wasn't there for the charm, though. He just needed oat milk, protein bars, and a bag of sweet potatoes. As he approached the entrance, the automatic doors slid open with a soft hum. The cold air from the store's AC brushed his face, sending a brief chill down his spine. He didn't know it yet, but this would be the moment where his day took a sharp turn. Radley's Market had a clean, polished feel. Its aisles were narrow but neatly organized, each section clearly labeled. The scent of fresh bread from the in-store bakery mixed with the faint, sterile smell of cleaning products. Bright fluorescent lights illuminated everything with an almost surgical precision, from the shiny white floors to the vibrantly colored produce stands. The customers moved about quietly, some scanning shelves, others checking items off lists on their phones. The store's background music played softly, smooth jazz that barely registered in the mind. At the front of the store, there was a wide service counter where customers could ask for assistance. This counter was where the store manager, Daniel Whitman, spent most of his time. Daniel was in his mid-40s, with sharp, angular features and neatly combed salt and pepper hair. His crisp white button-down was tucked perfectly into his khaki pants, and his name tag, Daniel, store manager, gleamed under the lights. If Marcus carried himself with quiet confidence, Daniel embodied the aura of "I'm in charge, and I need you to know it." His posture was rigid, his eyes always darting around like a hawk scanning for prey. He prided himself on maintaining order in his store, often misinterpreting ordinary customer actions as suspicious behavior. Today was no different. From his perch at the service counter, Daniel noticed Marcus as soon as he entered. His eyes followed him for a few extra seconds, not long enough to be obvious, but long enough for Marcus to feel it. This wasn't the first time Marcus had felt those eyes on him, but he brushed it off like usual. He knew what it was. He'd seen it before. The look, the one that says, "I'm watching you." Marcus took a deep breath, turned toward the produce aisle, and kept moving. While scanning the produce section, Marcus noticed it again. That feeling. The subtle awareness that someone was observing him. It was a sixth sense he had honed over the years, especially after multiple experiences of being randomly followed in stores. He glanced sideways and, sure enough, he caught Daniel's gaze from across the aisle. "Not today," Marcus muttered under his breath. "Just get the potatoes and keep it moving." He picked up a bag of sweet potatoes, turning it over a few times as if inspecting it, but mostly to give himself a reason to stand still. His heart wasn't racing, not yet, but he could feel his patience thinning. Across the store, Daniel tapped on his phone, pretending to check store metrics. In reality, he was opening the store's internal security camera feed. He tapped through the screen, selecting the aisle Marcus was in. "Just keeping an eye on things," Daniel muttered to himself, eyes narrowed in suspicion. Two different men, two different perspectives, two different realities. For Marcus, this was just another grocery run. For Daniel, it was something else entirely. Something he felt he needed to control. And so, the stage was set. Marcus placed the bag of sweet potatoes in his basket, glancing at his mental checklist. Oat milk, protein bars, done after that, he thought, making his way toward the dairy aisle. He pulled out his phone to check the time. 10:07 a.m. Plenty of time before his Zoom meeting. He noticed a slight shift in the air. The kind that makes the hairs on the back of your neck stand up. His instincts kicked in. Someone's behind me, he realized, feeling the quiet pressure of eyes on him. He turned slightly and, just as he suspected, there was Daniel. Arms crossed, brows furrowed, staring like he'd just caught Marcus with a ski mask on. "Everything all right?" Marcus asked, lifting his head slightly, his voice calm but firm. "You need help finding something?" Daniel replied, his words coated in that familiar passive-aggressive tone Marcus knew too well. It wasn't a question. It was an accusation disguised as customer service. "Nah, I'm good. Just grabbing a couple of things," Marcus said, maintaining eye contact for a moment longer than usual. He turned and headed for the protein bar aisle. But Daniel didn't move. Marcus heard the steady click of footsteps behind him. "He's following me now," he thought, forcing himself to stay calm. Don't give him a reason. He scanned the shelves for his favorite protein bars, his fingers moving deliberately over the labels. "Hey!" Daniel's voice was sharp now, cutting through the air like a snapped twig. Marcus turned slowly, his jaw tightening. "Yeah, I've been watching you since you came in. You've been hanging around these aisles a little too long. What are you looking for?" Daniel's eyes flicked toward Marcus's hoodie, then his backpack. His gaze lingered there a second too long. "Looking for protein bars. You want to help me pick a flavor, or?" Marcus replied, keeping his tone steady. Daniel's eyes narrowed. "I think you should open that bag. Let me see what you've got in there." Marcus blinked in disbelief. "Excuse me?" His heart rate ticked up. "You serious right now?" "You heard me," Daniel said, stepping closer, his arms still crossed. "We have a policy against shoplifting, and I've seen you moving suspiciously since you walked in." The words hit Marcus like a punch to the chest. Shoplifting. It wasn't the first time he'd heard it, but it never got easier. His eyes scanned the room, catching glimpses of other shoppers slowing down to watch. Suddenly, it felt like all eyes were on him. Marcus froze for a moment, his hands still gripping the edge of the shelf. He knew this feeling, the heavy weight of being watched, scrutinized, judged. It was a feeling that had followed him since middle school, when a teacher accused him of cheating on a test because his answers were too good. "All right, calm down," he told himself, taking a slow breath through his nose. "Don't give them a reason." He turned to face Daniel fully, keeping his hands where everyone could see them. "I'm not opening my bag," Marcus said, his voice even and clear. "I'm shopping, not stealing. If you think I took something, check your cameras." Daniel's eyes narrowed even more, his lips pressing into a thin line. "Don't make this harder than it needs to be," he said, now taking a step forward. "Just show me the bag, and you can be on your way." "Nah, man," Marcus said, shaking his head. "Not happening." His voice was calm, but his pulse was hammering in his ears. He knew how this could end if it went too far. A few customers nearby had stopped pretending to shop. A woman holding a box of cereal glanced from Marcus to Daniel, her lips pursed in quiet disapproval. Another man pulled out his phone and held it at chest level, the telltale sign of someone recording. "This guy's serious?" Marcus muttered under his breath. He made eye contact with the man recording, hoping the camera would capture the whole scene. "You really calling me a thief because I'm looking at protein bars?" His voice rose just a little, not too much, but enough to make sure the bystanders heard him. "I'm doing my job," Daniel shot back. "If you don't have anything to hide, just show me the bag." The old, familiar mix of anger and exhaustion crept up on Marcus. He'd been here before. Accused, humiliated, told to cooperate, to prove his innocence. But not today. Marcus's hands balled into fists inside his hoodie pockets, but he didn't move. "You're wasting my time, man," he said through gritted teeth. His eyes darted to the clock on the wall. 10:18 a.m. He had 40 minutes before his client call. All this for some protein bars? He could feel his Saturday unraveling. This was supposed to be a quick run to the store, in, out, and back home. But now he was in a standoff with a store manager who had already made up his mind. His mind flickered with options. Do I walk out? Do I stay? He knew that walking out could be seen as fleeing the scene, but staying meant dealing with this power-hungry manager. And that was the part that hit the hardest. No matter what he did, he'd be seen as the problem. "Call the police," Daniel said suddenly, tilting his head toward a cashier. His words echoed through the aisle like a siren. "What?" Marcus turned sharply, eyes wide with disbelief. "Call the police," Daniel repeated, louder this time, so everyone could hear. "Tell them we have a possible theft in progress." Marcus's heart dropped. "You serious right now? You really calling the cops on me?" His voice boomed now, his self-control fraying at the edges. "All this over groceries?" Shoppers moved away like waves parting around a storm. Some looked at him with quiet sympathy. Others shook their heads and whispered to each other. He knew what they were thinking. He'd seen it too many times. A voice came over the store intercom. "Security to aisle 6. Marcus felt his breathing get faster. The man with the phone camera kept recording. His eyes met Marcus's, and he gave him a small, reassuring nod. "I got you, bro," he mouthed. But it didn't matter. Marcus knew how this went. He'd seen it play out on TV, on social media, in the news. He backed away slowly, keeping his hands up, his heart pounding like a drum. "Yeah, call them," he said, his voice sharp with frustration. "Call them. Make sure you tell them I didn't steal anything." Daniel's face remained stone cold. "I'm just doing my job," he muttered, pulling out his own phone and tapping in numbers. Marcus shook his head. "Nah, man. You ain't doing your job. You're playing security guard, 'cause you think I look like a threat." Silence. The only sound was the smooth jazz overhead and the faint beeping of cash registers. This wasn't how his day was supposed to go. He had deadlines. He had work to do. But now, he had to stand there and wait for the police to arrive. All because he wanted protein bars and sweet potatoes. The distant wail of sirens grew louder, cutting through the hum of the store's air conditioning and the clatter of carts. Each second felt like an hour to Marcus. He kept his eyes fixed on the entrance, his heart thudding in his chest. The sirens stopped. "They're here." Shoppers parted like a wave as two uniformed police officers entered. One tall and broad with a clean-shaven head, the other shorter with a stern, tight-lipped expression. Their eyes locked onto Marcus like heat-seeking missiles. Daniel pointed straight at him. "That's him," Daniel called out, waving them over. "He's been acting suspicious since he walked in." One of the officers, Officer Grant, approached first, resting his hand on his duty belt. "Sir, we got a report of possible theft. We need you to step over here and talk to us." His voice was firm but not loud. The calm before the storm. "Man, I've done nothing wrong," Marcus replied, taking a small step backward. His hands were up, fingers spread wide. "I'm shopping. Look in my basket. I got sweet potatoes and protein bars." "That's it." Officer Grant glanced at Daniel, who was now standing behind the officers, arms crossed, chin tilted up like he'd won something. "That right?" Grant said, raising an eyebrow. "You got anything in your bag we need to know about?" Marcus gritted his teeth. No, and I'm not opening it for you or him, he said, his eyes darting between the officers. If you think I stole something, check the cameras. They're right there. He pointed to a blinking security camera above the aisle. The shorter officer, Officer Mills, stepped forward now, more aggressive. Look, we can do this the easy way, or we can do it the hard way, he said, his hand inching toward his handcuffs. You serious right now? Marcus's eyes widened in disbelief. You're treating me like a criminal and I'm just shopping. His voice cracked with frustration. More phones came out. More cameras were pointed in his direction. The crowd had grown larger, shoppers whispering, eyes shifting from Marcus to the officers. He ain't doing nothing. A woman called out from behind the bread aisle. All that for some groceries? Y'all gotta be kidding. The woman stepped forward, her hair wrapped in a bright yellow scarf. She wore a blue jacket and thick glasses that reflected the fluorescent lights. Her voice was sharp and clear. You Harrison this man 'cause he's black. Y'all don't do this to nobody else in here. Ma'am, stay back, Officer Mills snapped, pointing a finger at her like she was a misbehaving child. I'm staying right here, she shot back, crossing her arms. Somebody gotta bear witness to this mess. Behind her, the man with the phone continued recording, his focus steady. World gotta see this, he muttered. Even one of the cashiers, a teenage boy with a mop of curly hair, looked on nervously from behind the counter. His eyes darted from Daniel to Marcus, then to the officers. He leaned toward another cashier, whispered something, and shook his head. Daniel, however, stayed smug, like he was watching a play where he was both director and audience. He glanced at the woman in the yellow scarf, rolled his eyes, and muttered loud enough for people to hear. Always someone trying to make it about race. Her head snapped toward him. Oh, it is about race, she barked, jabbing her finger in his direction. If he didn't look like him, you wouldn't have said nothing. All right, enough, Officer Mills said, his patience wearing thin. He reached for Marcus's arm. Turn around, man. What? Marcus yanked his arm back, eyes wild now. I didn't do anything. Check the cameras. The crowd gasped. Don't touch him, the woman yelled, stepping forward. A few more shoppers pulled out their phones, filming every second. You need to relax, Officer Mills growled, pulling his handcuffs from his belt with a metallic clink. I am relaxed, Marcus barked, his voice raw with disbelief. I'm just shopping, man. Marcus's breathing was shallow now, his chest rising and falling like he'd run a mile. Keep your cool, he told himself, his mind flickering with every story he'd seen on the news. He'd seen too many of them. Men with faces just like his pinned to the ground, faces pressed into concrete, gasping, pleading, don't be next. Don't be next. But how do you stay calm when two officers are closing in on you? Handcuffs in plain sight. His instincts were at war. Part of him wanted to yell, to scream, to fight back. But he knew how that would end. He'd seen that story before too. His fingers twitched. His mind flashed back to the calm morning he'd planned. Just groceries. Sweet potatoes. Protein bars. Zoom meeting at 11. That was all it was supposed to be. Now he was standing here, a phone camera in his face, an officer reaching for his wrist, the world waiting for him to act up so they could say, see? He deserved it. But he wouldn't give them that. His eyes darted to the man filming. A lifeline. They're watching. Stay steady, Marcus reminded himself, forcing his breath to slow. He felt his pulse thudding against his temples. Then he saw her. A woman walking briskly toward them from the store entrance. She wasn't a shopper. She wasn't security. She moved with a purpose that only people with authority have. Her blazer was sharp, charcoal gray, her stride unshakable. Her eyes were locked on the scene in front of her, her mouth set in a hard line. Marcus blinked, recognition setting in. No way, he muttered under his breath. That's no way. Daniel noticed her too. His face shifted from smug confidence to confusion. He uncrossed his arms, his fingers twitching. He squinted, his eyes darting toward the officers. Who's that? He muttered under his breath. Officer Grant noticed her next. His posture straightened, his hands lowering from his belt. Wait, is that? He asked Officer Mills, his voice quieter now. The woman's heels clicked against the tiled floor, her face like stone. Her gaze didn't shift. She was locked on Daniel. People began whispering as she approached, her name spreading through the crowd like wildfire. "That's the owner," someone whispered. "No, that's the mayor," said another. Daniel's eyes went wide. His throat bobbed as he swallowed hard. His eyes flicked to Marcus, then to the officers. "No, no, no," he muttered, his cool crumbling. He suddenly looked like a man realizing he'd walked into quicksand. The woman reached the aisle. The officers shifted, suddenly unsure of themselves. "What's going on here?" she demanded, her voice sharp as a razor. The woman's eyes swept the scene like a spotlight on a stage. She stood tall and still, letting the weight of her presence settle on everyone. Her name was Karen Whitfield, but she wasn't just any store owner. She was also the mayor of the city. Her gaze shifted from Marcus to the officers, then to Daniel, and finally to the gathering crowd. Her voice cut through the air like a blade. "What is going on here?" Silence. The officers exchanged a glance. Officer Grant cleared his throat and stepped forward. "We received a report of suspicious activity," he said, gesturing toward Marcus without making eye contact. "Manager called us to investigate." Karen raised one brow, her face an unreadable mask. She turned her head slowly toward Daniel. "Is that right, Daniel?" she asked, her tone deadly calm. Daniel's face flushed red, his eyes darting from her to Marcus and back to the officers. He stammered, "Why, yeah. I thought he was acting strange." He kept walking around, and he had his bag open. He rubbed the back of his neck, his earlier bravado nowhere to be found. Looked like he might have been stealing. Karen nodded slowly, as if processing every word. Her gaze didn't break from Daniel. "You thought," she repeated, her eyes narrowing. "Did you ask him if he needed help? Did you check the security footage?" Daniel shifted uncomfortably, glancing at the officers as if they might back him up. I didn't think it was necessary. I just called." Karen's eyes turned ice cold. "You just called." She stepped forward, each footstep like a ticking clock. "You didn't check. You didn't ask. But you called the police on a paying customer." Her voice dropped to a low, deliberate tone that made the hairs on everyone's neck stand up. "And you had them put their hands on him?" Her eyes flicked to Officer Mills, who instantly lowered his handcuffs. Officer Mills raised his hands, backing up a step. "We were just responding to the call, ma'am." "No, you escalated it," Karen replied sharply, not even looking at him. "And you, Daniel," she took one step closer. "You put this man's life in danger because you thought something?" Her voice didn't rise, but somehow, it cut deeper than any shout. Daniel's lips parted, but no words came out. "Unbelievable," Karen said, exhaling sharply. "Absolutely unbelievable." Karen turned to Marcus, her gaze softening just a bit. "Sir, I'm so sorry this happened to you," she said, her voice full of sincerity. "Can you tell me your name?" Marcus blinked, his guard still up, unsure if this was a setup. He glanced around at the officers, then back at her. Marcus Reed," he said cautiously. Karen nodded. "Marcus Reed," she repeated, as if committing it to memory. "I'm Karen Whitfield. I'm the owner of this store, and also the mayor of this city." The crowd murmured. "She's the mayor?" someone whispered. Phones were still recording, and you could feel the tension shift in the room like a gust of wind. "I'm going to be very clear, Marcus," Karen said, stepping closer to him, her eyes full of warmth but also unwavering resolve. "You didn't deserve any of this. This was wrong from start to finish. And it ends now." Marcus felt his throat tighten. He'd spent the last 20 minutes being treated like a criminal, and now this? He nodded once, not trusting himself to speak. Karen turned to the officers, her eyes sharp again. "Officers, I think we're done here." Grant opened his mouth to respond, but Karen raised a hand to silence him. "I said we're done." She stepped closer. "You can either walk yourselves out, or I can make a call to your chief. Your choice." Grant glanced at Mills, then back at Karen. "Yes, ma'am," he muttered, turning toward the door. Mills followed, his face locked in a scowl. Karen waited until they were gone before turning to Daniel. Her eyes bore into him like a judge delivering a sentence. "Turn in your badge, Daniel." "Wait, what?" Daniel's eyes went wide. "You can't be serious, Ms. Whitfield. I've been here for 4 years." "I'm very serious," Karen said, her tone unyielding. "You're a liability. This is not the first time I've heard complaints about you, but it will be the last. Turn in your badge and leave my store." Daniel's face went pale. He opened his mouth, but no sound came out. The crowd was watching him now, and he knew there was no coming back from this. He looked around, hoping for sympathy, but all he saw were eyes full of disgust. He slowly reached for his lanyard, unclipped it, and handed it to her. His hands trembled. "This ain't right," he muttered. "This ain't right at all." Karen leaned in close, her voice low but firm. "Neither was what you did to Marcus." Marcus watched Daniel walk toward the exit, his shoulders slumped, head down. A part of him felt satisfaction, but it wasn't joy. It wasn't peace. It wasn't victory. It was something heavier, like carrying a weight that had finally shifted but hadn't disappeared. He glanced down at his hands, still trembling. His breath came in slow, shallow pulls. His chest ached with tension that hadn't released yet. His mind replayed the moment Officer Mills reached for his wrist, that flicker of panic when he thought, "This is it. This is where it all goes wrong." He didn't know he was holding his breath until he let it go, his shoulders dropping. He wiped his face with both hands, letting out a long, shaky breath. "You okay, Marcus?" Karen asked, stepping beside him. She didn't touch him. She knew better. But her presence felt grounding. Marcus nodded slowly, still catching his breath. Yeah, I'm good," he said, though his voice cracked. Thanks for showing up." Karen tilted her head, giving him a small but sincere smile. "We have to show up for each other," she said simply. "You matter. Never forget that." Those words hit deeper than he expected. His eyes stung, but he blinked it away. "I'm trying," he admitted quietly. "Some days it's just hard." Karen nodded, understanding in her eyes. "I know. But today, you didn't just survive. You were seen. And that matters too." The woman in the yellow scarf approached, still filming, her face beaming with pride. "I got it all, brother," she said, holding up her phone. "You walked out of this with your head up. That's gonna mean something." Marcus glanced at her, then at the crowd, still watching. "Yeah," he said, his voice steadier now. "I guess it will." The people around him clapped. Not loud, not raucous, but steady. A show of solidarity. For the first time in a long while, Marcus felt like he could breathe. The next morning, Marcus sat at his kitchen table, scrolling through his phone. The video of the incident had gone viral. Clips of Karen's commanding presence, Daniel's awkward retreat, and Marcus's quiet dignity were all over social media. "Mayor defends black customer from racial profiling store manager." That headline had been shared by dozens of news outlets. The comments poured in. "This is what leadership looks like. Salute to Mayor Karen. Imagine how many times this happens when there's no camera. Proud of you, Marcus. Stay strong, King." He didn't realize his hands were shaking until he set the phone down. It wasn't fear this time. It was something more complicated. He leaned back, rubbing his palms against his jeans. Later that day, his phone buzzed with a call from an unknown number. He almost ignored it, but decided to answer. "Hello? Hi, Marcus. It's Karen Whitfield." He sat up straighter. "Oh, hi, Mayor Whitfield. Thanks for calling." "No, thank you," she said, her voice steady but warm. "I know yesterday was a lot. I just wanted to check in on you personally." Marcus glanced at the kitchen window, watching a couple of kids ride their bikes down the street. He nodded, even though she couldn't see it. "Yeah, I'm all right. Just processing it all." Karen's voice softened. "I understand. I also wanted you to know we're taking action. Daniel is gone. That's non-negotiable. I've scheduled a company-wide training on racial bias and de-escalation tactics for all employees. It's overdue, and I'm ashamed it took this to make it happen." Marcus let out a slow breath. "That's good to hear. It's the least we can do," she replied. "I'll be honest, Marcus. I'm not perfect. I've had to learn and unlearn things myself, but I'm committed to doing better." If there's anything I can do for you, let me know. There was a pause. Marcus's mind flashed back to the moment Daniel called the police, the weight of those handcuffs inches from his wrists. You already did, he said quietly. You showed up. The next weekend, Marcus returned to the store. Not because he had to, but because he wanted to. He needed to reclaim that space for himself. He stepped through the automatic doors, his chest tight, eyes scanning every aisle like a soldier on patrol. But something was different. Customers were moving freely. Employees were smiling, and one of them even waved. A young employee in a blue apron approached. Hey, sir. Need help finding anything? Marcus blinked, caught off guard. Yeah. Actually, where's the baking aisle? Aisle 7, she said with a smile, pointing down the way. Need help carrying anything? He almost laughed. Nah, I'm good. Thanks, though. He walked toward aisle 7, glancing at the cameras in the corners. He didn't feel the weight of them as much this time. As he picked up a bag of sugar, a familiar voice called out, Marcus. He turned to see Karen Whitfield approaching with a shopping basket on her arm. She wore a plain hoodie and jeans, her usual commanding presence replaced by something more casual but still self-assured. Didn't think I'd run into you here, Marcus said, smiling. I told you I'd show up, she replied, her grin matching his. She glanced at his basket. Making something sweet? Yeah, my mom's favorite peach cobbler, Marcus said, lifting the bag of sugar. Figured I'd do something that makes me feel good. Karen tilted her head, her smile turning thoughtful. That's a good way to reclaim the day, she said. If you ever want to share that recipe, I wouldn't mind learning it. Marcus chuckled. I'll think about it. Later that evening, Marcus stood in his kitchen, the smell of peaches, sugar, and cinnamon filling the air. The bubbling cobbler sat on the counter, golden brown and perfect. He leaned against the counter, arms crossed, just watching it cool. His mind wandered back to the store, to Daniel's face, to the officer gripping his wrist, to the crowd recording on their phones. But now, when he thought about it, he also saw Karen Whitfield stepping in, her steady voice, her firm gaze. You didn't deserve any of this, she'd said. Those words lingered with him. For so long, Marcus had felt like he had to prove he belonged. Every space he walked into, every store, every interview, every room where he wasn't expected, he carried that weight. Yesterday, he'd seen the worst of it, but he also saw something else. He'd seen someone use their power for him, not against him. And maybe that was the shift he needed. He exhaled slowly, staring at the cobbler like it was the answer to every question he hadn't asked. Yeah, he whispered to himself. Today, I showed up too. Marcus took the peach cobbler to his mother's house that evening. The sun was just starting to set, painting the sky in soft pinks and oranges. His mom opened the door, her eyes lighting up when she saw him holding the dish. You made it right this time? She teased, stepping aside to let him in. You'll have to taste it to find out, he shot back, grinning. She set the table, humming a song he'd known since childhood. Marcus sat across from her, watching as she took her first bite. Her eyes closed, a satisfied smile spreading across her face. That's it, she said, nodding slowly. That's the one. They ate in comfortable silence, broken only by quiet laughter and the clinking of spoons on ceramic. The world outside still buzzed with tension, with unseen cameras, with assumptions and misunderstandings. But inside this house, with his mom, the warmth of peach cobbler, and a moment of peace, Marcus felt something he hadn't felt in a long time. He felt home. Every day, people face judgments based on assumptions. But this story reminds us that accountability, leadership, and courage can change the outcome. Stand up for justice. Speak out against bias. Be like Karen Whitfield. Show up when it matters. If this story moved you, share it. Let someone know that they're seen, valued, and never alone. Together, we can create a world where everyone feels at home. Like, share, and comment. Let's keep the conversation going.